Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and today my guest is Jim Capuano, CEO at Horizon, a telecom provider whose history, as you will hear, goes all the way back to 1895. I had Jim on the show to talk about some of these big picture issues that we run into often, like middle mile performance, last mile access, expanding fiber to the premises, and of course the digital divide. But from the perspective of a company that's actually working in the trenches, literally sort of as they are currently expanding fiber access for customers all over their home region and sometimes digging trenches for that. So we talk about the middle mile issue and the role that providers like Horizon can play in connecting consumers to the content that they're after from all kinds of locations of different sizes. And then we get into the digital divide and broadband access, spend most of our time there, especially in light of the major infrastructure bill in the US that has put billions of dollars on the line toward that effort. Jim shares a really interesting story about how changes in regulations on hanging new wires on poles impacted their business. And we get down to some of the details of the economics of getting wireline access to as many people and companies as possible. So I found this conversation really interesting to relate some of those global big picture issues that come up that are really all over the world, even though we're focused on one part of the US in this conversation, and bring that down to how that actually plays out at the most local scale. So let's get to the interview. All right. Welcome to the show, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. Very exciting.
Great. I always start out the show with just a background of you, and in this case, I think maybe a background of Horizon as well. I'm sure that a lot of listeners are not familiar with you as a company. So,
yeah. No. Well, again, thank you. So, just a little bit of my background. I'll bore you to go back to high school when it all started, right? But but seriously, coming out of high school, I was a kid that wanted to work with my hands. So I went into the United States Air Force to start, and I turned it into a 25-year National Guard career as well. So it was kind of like my other life for many years.
Yeah.
But going from there, where I worked on electronics and radar equipment specifically, I got a job with MCI Telecommunications as a field engineer, and then which was an incredible time. Really lucky, if you will, to get into a fiber optic based career path.
Right.
I was working on fiber splicing and DWDM equipment and microwave radio even back then, and some synchronous and asynchronous and all kinds of really interesting transmission platforms that were all using fiber as the base. And then I'll kind of fast forward here. Throughout my career, it was really taking that experience as a field engineer and working my way through engineering and operations gigs all the way until getting to my present job, which is maybe a little bit different in that I came up through the engineering and operations side.
Right.
Get to
No,
the
I'm
CEO
sure
job.
lots of people in the industry love it when an engineer actually is in charge and truly understands the goings on of the network rather than approaching it from just a business standpoint.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, at least you're right. The engineering and operations people have a tendency to like it, obviously. But no, I think the other piece there is that I got to experience the business and at every level, if you will. So it gives me a little bit more insight into maybe exactly how people do some of these jobs. But
Right.
so I've been very fortunate from that perspective. And from a company perspective, Horizon was founded in 1895, so
Wow.
we've been around for over 125 years. Interestingly, we were actually the competitor to the Bell system at the time. So Chillicothe, Ohio, actually had two local phone companies. simultaneously, and this was before we had any form
I was going to say, yeah,
of,
very unusual.
of
Yeah.
internet, right?
Yeah.
So you had two phone numbers if you had both. If you were on both systems, you had to have a phone number on either, and there
Hmm.
was no way to traffic between the two. But the company actually won that battle, and we became the local phone company for that region.
Hmm.
Like I said, over 125 years ago. So companies had a couple of iterations since then, but we have a middle mile network that we call Network Partners. It's a enterprise fiber business, um, kind of focused more on mission critical networks there,
Hmm.
healthcare, higher ed. We also sell to wholesale to other carriers. We support cell tower backhaul and small cell as well. So kind of the infrastructure or foundation company, if you will, for most of the uh, communication services in that region.
Right.
And then finally, the latest division of the company is our fiber to the premise business, which there's a lot of talk about. Obviously, this in this particular area in our industry. Um, it's interesting because it is a residential service platform, but there's a lot of private money being invested in it, as well
Hmm.
as we've all heard about the infrastructure money coming
Right.
into the region.
Yeah. Definitely
Mm,
something I want to get to there.
yeah.
Before we move on to that, I think it's a really interesting perspective here of sort of the ILEC, the transport fiber provider, and then also ISP. But you had told me when we talked previously that you're actually the first CEO of the company to not have the same last name. Could you take us
Yeah,
through
that
that
is true.
history?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. The company, again, I think was in 1900 was the last time there was somebody with a different last name. So
Wow.
it was a family-owned business for over 120 years. Yeah,
Yeah, now
it's
I think
pretty
that really brings
amazing.
into perspective, especially for most of our listeners, come from North America, but we certainly have listeners
Mm,
in Europe and elsewhere around the world,
sure.
and so understanding that picture of the in the U.S. Well, we'll say the word probably a lot, ILEC, but local
Oh,
telephone company that there's hundreds of them, right? Sorry,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I was going to say that's a pretty good takeaway because I think often we hear incumbent lec, but independent telephone company is also a pretty
Mm.
common
Mm-hmm.
term.
Mm-hmm.
And the independent telephone company was a company that was not part of the Bell system back in the day.
Right.
So, like you said, hundreds of them that are and almost I would say many of them, if not most of them, are still family owned.
Right.
So family or community owned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these small communities were had shareholders where the actual residents where they chipped in, if you will, to fund their telephone company back then.
Right.
Many of
Right.
them were founded by farmers, that those types of things. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think it cues us up well for the gist of this conversation, which is going to be, first kind of talking about middle mile as an issue, and then secondly, the digital divide and the difficulty of local access. But that the reason that there's these hundreds of ILECs still left in the U.S. is our geographic diffuse nature in the U.S. That it was, it didn't make economic sense for the big sort of urban telecom companies always to necessarily build out to every sort of end user. So that's why I think I really wanted your particular perspective of running a company like this. So Jim, I think maybe we'll start with the middle mile. I thought maybe you could give us from your perspective a definition of the middle mile. Lots of listeners to the show have heard this term used. It does get used in slightly different ways depending on who's talking. But as a middle mile provider in the U.S., how do you define that segment?
Right. Well, when you look at these, especially where in parts of the country where you have, these independent telephone companies or ILECs, the infrastructure that's needed to move the traffic from their communities, to, whether it be the internet drains, the tier ones, you have to have a means to interconnect these communities, in the middle mile is really what that is. So it's
Hmm.
the connectivity from across a region from community to community. We've most of these networks that have been built that are middle that are classified as middle mile, you'll also find that they typically support the wireless
Hmm.
industry, with cell tower backhaul. I think a lot of people are surprised to find out uh, that when you're making a cell phone call, that once you hit the cell tower, that you
It's all
don't actually
wires.
bounce from, right? That it
Yeah.
doesn't actually go from cell tower to cell tower. It
Hmm.
actually, once it hits a tower, it drops down and goes through a fiber cable, typically now, back to a switching facility. So,
Right.
especially in rural parts of the country, these carriers have to rely on other providers. So,
Hmm.
middle mile networks are, because of that, are also typically somewhat agnostic to competition.
Hmm.
I think we've kind of coined the phrase, co-opetition, where there's a very healthy wholesale business that runs where you're really enabling your competitors into these
Right.
different markets as you're going, right? So
Hmm.
so it's kind of you have to have that relationship, in order to really succeed. It's almost impossible, honestly, to cover you know uh, the amount of geography we're talking about,
Right.
with any real density, without other people doing it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's become really interesting in sort of my world. As this podcast is now called Telegeography Explains the Internet, because we've expanded the focus, but it started out as a wide area networks focused podcast. And so middle mile
Mhm.
was really a wholesale issue for a long time, right? But now
Right.
that enterprises are, and lots of, all the way down to, smaller companies as well, are using the internet more as their sort of primary connectivity, because they're using cloud services and all that. All
Right.
of a sudden it starts to matter to you a lot more what happens to your traffic between when it leaves your home or your office or whatever, and when it
Yeah.
gets to your cloud provider, or whatever its final destination is, right?
Right. That's absolutely true. Yeah, and I think you know the quality of that pipe has become such an
Mm.
issue, right?
Hmm.
I mean, what we're doing right now, you
Yeah.
know, uh, from a residence, back into the cloud, and to connect with you. You know, it wasn't that long ago that the internet just would not have been capable
Hmm.
of supporting this technology, right?
Right.
Not with the amount that we use it today, with obviously. But I think the WAN piece of it, um, you know, like everybody expected that, I guess maybe the early definition of what SD-WAN looked like,
Hmm.
and what that was going to do to the world.
Hmm.
um, I think it's an interesting product, and that I think it's continuing to evolve.
Right.
It was we looked at it as an MPLS replacement product in many
Hmm.
ways,
Very
right?
much. Yeah. Yeah, that
And
was the
then
first. That's, going back 5 or 6 years ago, everybody would have said, "Oh, MPLS is going to disappear because SD-WAN's going to." Yeah, exactly.
right, right, and I, and it's funny, as a service provider, the MPLS product offering wasn't wasn't something that we were excited about,
Hmm.
honestly, and mainly because of it was the demands that were put on it, especially when there were any changes that were needed to the network.
Mm. Hmm.
There was a lot of choreographing, and
Hmm.
working with the customers were having to call us to manipulate the pipe so that
Right.
they could change this, what they wanted. That takes a lot of time, and and obviously, there was a lot of pricing pressure placed on that product, to do it as inexpensively as you could, but also make it like this really high quality experience,
Hmm.
which,
Hmm.
those demand curves kind of go in opposite
Yes,
directions
indeed.
typically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, right. But I think, the SD-WAN piece, when it first came out, the theory was, well, we'll use broadband connections on the edges of the network, and we're going to save a lot of money by not using, private line connectivity.
Right.
The advantage also of being able to reroute directly to content from the edge sounded
Hmm.
really exciting too.
Right.
And we find that that's still the case. I mean, there's still definitely opportunities for that. But one of the things I would say is that what we're really seeing is, the people that can take true advantage of those types of deployments are really big networks, and they're,
Mm-hmm.
like, so it might be, across, a multi-continent,
Right.
in the United States it could be, super regional, or across the country, continental. But when we're actually seeing it also coming into use a lot more in like a metro market.
Mm-hmm.
So say that you have a bunch of banks are a great example, right? So like regional banks, they'll have branches where they want to be able to use the ability to reduce the cost, if you will, on the private line piece. So you don't always need a lot of bandwidth to go to a bank branch.
Right.
So broadband might be okay for that. But what we're actually finding is that, one, when you're in a smaller region, the ability to offload that traffic and send it directly to a content provider, um, the latency isn't really a factor anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're already in the metro, right? So,
Right.
you're going to carve off a couple microseconds to that content provider. Probably doesn't really matter that much. Um, but also, if you're using like I don't know if this is a technical term or not, but a crappy broadband connection.
Yeah, it's definitely a technical term when you're dealing with it, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly right. But I mean, if you look at some of these broadband connections, the latency that you're seeing there is so high,
Mm-hmm.
because of the way that those particular providers deliver those services, that that can actually induce a lot more latency than actually
Mm-hmm.
sending it back to your data center and having a DIA connection directly to the internet. You could actually save a lot of latency and have a
Right.
much higher quality product. So we're actually seeing it almost as like an overlay to some networks, where you'll see places where they'll use broadband, because it's effective, but it's more of a hybrid in that they're using a lot more private line to interconnect them, but it
Mm-hmm.
gives them the visibility, in the features that you get in SD-WAN, to take advantage of over a private line network in a metro market. So like I said, I think it's an interesting product because it just continues to evolve, and it's giving the consumer, or the enterprise, a lot more flexibility in how
Right.
they use the service that we provide them, without me getting involved in their in their day-to-day network operations. They can handle everything. They get big pipes, and you know, we hand them a MEF quality
Right.
Ethernet pipe, and they do whatever they want with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the key, right? Is that that we need development of that middle mile so that it's there. However, whatever kind of routing you're using, whatever the destination is, like you said, to a content provider, or maybe office to office, that kind of thing. But that for a long time, the sort of focus had been so much on the backbone connections, and the sort of telco focused. MPLS is
Right,
very much like a provider network kind of thing. This offers the opportunity to spread all of that out. So
right.
good for folks like you, I guess. It's a,
Yeah. Well, and we're always looking for ways that we can provide. I guess I should probably qualify that before I
mhm,
just. Not all service providers may think the way that I'm suggesting, and
of
I'm sure
course,
that
yeah.
there would be great debate on what I just said about where the hybrid SD-WAN product is going,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But it's just like it's what we're seeing in our
Right.
region, in Ohio. So largely, so I just think that wherever we can find ways to improve the experience for our customers, that's always going to be a focus for us. We're always trying to find ways to reduce the cost so that we can provide that service, competitively against other people, and still provide a higher quality of service.
Hmm.
It's, that's it's hard to do. I'll be
Yeah.
honest.
Very,
You know,
very hard to do. Yeah, it was, well, that cues me up. I think great for sort of the next major topic here of the, broadly the digital divide, but the way that we think of it, from our perspective at telegeography, for example, is more like local access, right? Broadband availability, that kind of thing, right? So I just wonder if you could maybe start us out with the big picture of what is the problem here, whether it's consumers, residential, small office, home office, all the way up to the enterprise, because enterprises with thousands of sites around the world have offices located in rural Ohio sometimes, right? So if I wonder if you could sort of lay out the problem from the perspective of someone who solves it, as you will, if you will, you know.
You know, boy. So the problem.
Yeah, yeah, yes, exactly.
Yeah, no problem. That's a layup. That's a layup question,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Look, I would just, I guess I would lead off by saying, you know, fiber to the home, and the digital divide. So first off, we definitely have a tendency to focus on rural America when we
Hmm.
talk about this. Obviously we provide services to some relatively rural areas of Ohio and West Virginia, in Indiana. Um, but it's funny, we kind of get caught in this where we talk about just these real rural areas. And the reality is that it's not just rural America that's struggling with this
Hmm.
too. I mean,
Hmm.
you can get into downtown,
Yeah.
USA in a lot of places and still have these same problems. So,
Right.
I kind of, first off, to put the spotlight on it, it's not just a rural problem. It's a national problem. And we have allowed, I guess I'll go down the path of the where competition and inviting competition into places obviously has not all hasn't always been I guess I'll use the word fair.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean that history in the U.S. is difficult. But, I always, when I explain it, especially to lay people, like to say, okay, well, you have this problem of if you plug something into an outlet in the wall, there's a single outlet, and there's this difficulty people have getting over is the internet like that, right?
Yeah.
It would be silly to have sort of two different electrical outlets, or is the internet
Hmm.
something different? And I think that's been the fight that we've been having since telephone
Yeah.
service came along in the late 19th century, right? So
Sure. Yeah. And
yeah,
it's definitely different. It's definitely different. And it's increasingly so.
right,
So
exactly, yeah.
and I would say that so the real issues to getting to kind of you know uh, bridging the divide. Well, first off, recognizing the actual problem was probably the first piece. Is
Hmm.
so where is the divide, right? And you're gonna have to have those anchor points, if you will. But I would say that whether it's wherever it is, the ability to get fiber cable, which is how we bridge the majority of it today. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of other technologies, but at the base of it all, there's a fiber optic cable somewhere, right?
Right,
Whether it's
right,
a
exactly. And
WISP
just to
or
make that clear to anybody listening and that doesn't think a lot about broadband access or local access or whatever, that essentially, if you're not talking about fiber to the premises, then you're ultimately going over one of two technologies: a coaxial cable or a twisted pair. And
right.
coaxial is a little bit larger, but has its drawbacks in some cases. And twisted pair just does not have the bandwidth to meet modern day demands, right? So,
Yeah, exactly. We've done a lot to improve the twisted pair piece, and coax obviously as well. But whether we're bonding multiple pairs of copper together to
hmm.
get larger throughput, with a DSL type product, or with the on the coaxial side, you're talking about the my geez, the technology just fell out of my head. That's how much I think about it, right?
DOCSIS was it? Yeah,
DOCSIS, thank you,
yeah.
DOCSIS for that. When we look at it, we look at it as a fiber solution.
Hmm. Hmm.
It is the future-proofed product offering, right?
Right.
I guess maybe one that we didn't mention was wireless. We do
Hmm.
see WISP
Right.
WISPs out there trying to use fixed wireless, and then we're also seeing the cellular providers providing these pucks, if you will,
Hmm.
that connect to their 5G networks and whatnot. But even those technologies are fine. And I probably don't want to get into a debate.
Of course, yeah. But I think almost everybody would agree that a wire terminating somewhere in very near the premises is the gold standard of connectivity, essentially, right?
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's fair, and obviously that's why the amount of money that's being invested into it. That's why is because it's future proofed at that point.
Hmm.
Our we the fiber to the home or fiber to the premise networks that we build today on our network are 10 gig ready today,
Hmm.
right? And with the swap out of an optic, they could be 100 gig. So I
Right.
mean, the infrastructure, you know, to support this, there is no bandwidth number right now that we can say, well,
Hmm.
this it would cap out at whatever. Well, with a couple of swaps, there isn't a limitation right now. So
Right, right. Whereas on some other transport medium,
yeah,
you may run into some, sort
right.
of speed limit
Yeah.
that's insurmountable, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the next time you need a terabit at your house, you let us
Right.
know. We'll tell you how to do
Yeah.
it, right? So, but I mean, but kidding aside, I mean, we actually do build it where we use a dedicated fiber to every
Hmm.
home. So we're not, and in doing that, like I said, now all we're really doing is plugging it into a different port
Right.
in a box. So that piece has been solved back to the home. We don't have to do a whole lot of work to actually increase the amount of bandwidth we can provide. So again, today I could do 10 gig to every home, symmetrical 10 gig too, which is the
Hmm.
other surprise, right? So so anyway, I guess to the what we've decided to move forward with is a fiber-based solution that will support symmetrical 1 gig right out of the gate. We also have, again, we can do 5 and 10 gig as well if as needed, but it's not something we market. But
Hmm.
the infrastructure is there. Most consumers are still trying to get their head around the idea of having a symmetrical 1 gig connection.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, absolutely. Consumers, even when you're talking about IT infrastructure managers at major corporations, right? So we do a survey of networks, of major, sort of like Fortune 1000 size companies, and it's still the case for MPLS. Most offices are 20, 50 megs. Even on
right,
DIA, it's 100, 200, 500. So
right.
getting everyone a gig is definitely a massive leap from what's available out there in many cases. Yeah.
Well, and I would point out that, I mentioned earlier, so when we talk about speed, right? Everybody goes, well, I have a 500 meg connection. Well, that's
It's
speed. That's
contended.
not speed,
Right.
right? That's not
Yeah.
speed. First off, that is
Right.
not speed, right? Speed is how quickly can you get to your content back,
Right.
right? That's speed, right? So we focus a lot on latency,
Hmm.
with our
Hmm.
network. That is like, the quality of the pipe is really is truly more defined by the latency on
Hmm.
the pipe. So I can say I'm sure I'm not alone in that I have myself and many of my friends can tell you that they have very large connections into their homes that still have issues with
Of course.
pixelation on video and so forth.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is just the latency that they have to on their networks. So and then when you talk about buying a really large pipe, we obviously as a provider, I mean, we're we want to be able to support whatever applications our customers are running.
Hmm.
So even in these residential markets, it's interesting that we do see people buying 1 gig connections. It might be a little bit of bragging, quite honestly.
Yeah.
From
Sure. I mean,
I'm not saying that everybody needs
Yeah.
needs a full 1 gig, right? But from a cost perspective, it's not a huge delta from from say a 500 meg
Hmm.
connection to a 1 gig connection. So you know uh, you
Especially if
know
that middle mile piece is already in place, right? So,
right,
yeah.
exactly, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So I think we've decided that fiber is the best way to do that. But you know what? That's a great segue, and I appreciate that. Is that middle mile piece for us? Having that foundation to run our networks over, these smaller, metro, I guess you call them residential markets,
Hmm.
we build typically right on top of that.
Right.
So that therefore I can control, what happens to the throughput coming back as well.
Hmm.
So again, when I focus on latency, I'm also focusing on, all right, well, I also have this, really high speed middle mile network that I can leverage, for my residential network. So
Hmm.
my residential customers are getting a very high quality product,
Right.
but it's really hard to, I guess I would say, it's really hard to show that. Like
Hmm.
people, I think that finally, one of this is going to the craziest thing ever said. One of the great things that come out of COVID, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Not that there was anything great, right? But one of the interesting things that came out of COVID was that we did do so much video conferencing
Hmm.
with each other, and people actually did see the quality of their internet pipe at their in
Right.
their residence,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's very different. You can see it, right?
Well,
Like
not just that, but then they also had kids online at the same time, and maybe somebody
right,
gaming that's else's home, and
right,
so
right.
yeah, and all of your neighbors doing this at the same time. So if we go to that central office, then all of a sudden the contention ratio there is really important too, right? So
So having that dedicated pipe to the residents is really important, right?
hmm
So, we mentioned the DOCSIS networks earlier. They can't compete with that.
hmm hmm
That's their Achilles, right? Is
right,
that it's a shared network. The networks that we're building, they have a dedicated fiber right to the customer. So it's a dedicated internet pipe, from the beginning, from here to here. They're getting a pure gig guaranteed. There's no one else, contending for that throughput.
right.
So I think the technology is really important.
Hmm.
Um, but I guess maybe to shift to like the this all sounds great. Boy, we just build these everywhere. The whole world would be better, right?
It's not cheap.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
so there's your two big problems
yeah.
really that come into the entire thing are cost to build and time to build.
Mm-hmm.
And um, so the cost to build. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I think if you go back, I think it was 2018 timeframe, the FCC had a ruling on one-touch make-ready. And
Okay.
what make ready is, and it's in layman speak is, when if a when a service provider wants to put a cable on an existing uh, utility pole, they have to go through a process called make ready.
Mm.
And what that is it is you put in an application, and then whoever placed the pole, which we use the term pole owner because they're the ones that place the pole, and they're responsible for it. They go to all the other attachers on the pole, and first off, they engineer what you want to put on the pole to see if the pole will support
Right.
the additional weight or whatnot. And then, because of the way that we do it in most states, you have to move the existing attachers to make room for the new attacher.
Hmm.
So it's actually dumber than it sounds in some ways, but
Yeah.
right. But the process there is, you put in your paperwork, which takes a bunch of work. You have to do a lot to get an application
Right.
together, and when you put that in most states, it goes into there is no requirement for there's not like a shot clock where it's the
Hmm.
the utility has like 6 months to get back
Right.
to you. Most states there isn't one,
It
so
could
it just
happen
goes to
whenever they
them.
feel like it. Yeah.
And the other piece is they get to decide how much it's going to cost you as well.
Right.
So they go out and engineer it, and they come back and they say, well, geez, that pole has to be replaced. There's just no way
Mm.
that it can take this, support what you're asking.
Hmm.
So you have to replace that pole. Um, so in, like I said, in 2018, they came out with a ruling that said, to save time and money,
Hmm.
that we would do what's called one touch make ready, which means, so if you had like four cables on the pole with four different service providers, the old system would be where each one of them was responsible for preparing their cable into the new area, and they would take turns based on where they were on the pole.
Right.
So imagine how much time that would take, right? Just to get each one of them to schedule somebody to go out, and they can't leapfrog each other. So
Right.
this guy the guy on the top of the pole has to go first, and then the next guy comes out, and then the next guy, and so on. So anyway, so it took an extraordinary amount of time, and each one of them was allowed to charge the new attacher for that work.
Hmm.
So it's very expensive as well, or at least that's what we thought.
Right. Right.
Since then, they passed this rule where we would be able to use one contractor to go out and move everybody's cables all at once,
Right.
right? So it'd be a factor of four in time
Which
savings, right?
economy of scale and just kind of common sense, right?
Right. It just seems like it would be
Yeah.
the ultimate solution.
Yeah.
Well, so all right. So now we're in 2022, and I'm going to tell you some bad news. And the make ready process actually takes longer, and it is
Uh,
more expensive than ever.
okay.
So whatever that whole scenario was, it didn't really work out the way we had hoped.
Hmm.
And I guess I should be clear. I'm not here to complain about the utilities.
Sure.
That's not the point. I think the point is larger than that. It's that what we're seeing is um, the ability to get on poles is really difficult, and it's
Hmm.
taking a long time, and it's really expensive.
Right.
And when you factor all those pieces in, you know, uh, most customers aren't interested in buying something that they're not going to see for 2 years,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So you have a consumer issue there, right? But also, the cost of doing this work, um, you know, there's a lot of factors, but the reality is that we just don't have. It's just not happening fast enough, and it's obviously costing far too much money. It's almost double what I was seeing prior to 2018
Hmm.
is about half of what I'm seeing for
Wow.
cost to do it now. So it's very expensive. Um, so how do you bridge the divide when we look at an investment into a new market in a residential market, we estimate our cost to pass a residence. So
Hmm.
if I can find an area where I know I can build and have like the stability of a number, which I prefer not to get into the actual numbers here,
Sure,
but
of course, yeah, but for the economic point, yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah.
you have a business case that you're trying to solve for, and
Hmm.
how much per passing is one of the direct components to the business case.
Right.
And as we're going through that, if all of a sudden, the cost per mile is twice what it should be,
Hmm.
well, you have to have twice the number of residential units in that mile in order
Or
to make the
twice the
numbers.
spend per user, right.
Yeah, and it's just and that's so the reality is that if you can't get you know a less expensive means of getting down that road, it's a really hard road to build on.
Hmm.
So I think the divide, one of the big factors of the divide is the cost to build right now is really out of control. In that we're not, and it's interesting because I'm not seeing crazy numbers when it comes to labor. As
Hmm.
far as contractor labor and whatnot. I
Right.
mean, we've seen some increases, obviously with the labor markets, but not like what we've seen over the last say 5 years in this cost to just get a path ready. And then the other piece is there's a lot of folks that because of the cost to attach and the delays, there's service providers that are looking at 100% buried. That is a very
Mm-hmm.
expensive means to build a network too, and and it's unfortunate if you think about it that like you could do it. You can plow cable into the ground, or you can directionally bore it,
Right.
into the ground. But again, it's very time consuming, and there's a lot of labor that goes into it. Whereas the utility pole infrastructure is there.
It exists and can be serviced fairly easily, right? So yeah, you don't have to dig a hole to
Exactly.
service it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's advantages to putting it underground,
Sure.
like from a storm damage perspective
Right.
and so on. But also, most utility lines, that are maintained, they're the types of storms that we deal with. I mean, yes, there are outages due
Hmm.
to storm damage and whatnot, of course, but that's there's other ways to work on that too, right?
Hmm.
There are network technologies, that you overlay to solve
Right.
for
That's right. Yeah.
for paths, right?
It depends on the leg too, right? So there's like certain look at your electricity, right? It's that of course it's buried in your neighborhood, but then if it's going out to a trunk line that it's much more efficient to have so
Onto a high tension line,
right. Yeah.
right? Exactly right. That's aerial, by the way. As soon as it gets onto that, right?
Right.
So yeah, I guess part one is the cost to build is a huge factor in the
Hmm.
fixing the digital divide. The time factor obviously is important as well. Um, you know, we and I guess that, maybe another interesting takeaway here is that, there's a lot of private money that's being invested in this, in this area today. Um, but it's based on some basic principles, right?
Mm.
Every
Hmm.
business case has an expected return on investment. It's just,
Right.
that's how it works, right? So if you can't build in a timely fashion with a reasonable number, that private money could dry up quickly. And
Hmm.
the one thing that I worry about is that there is a little bit of a vibe out there that, like, everybody heard about this infrastructure money that's going to come in.
Right, right, exactly. And just to, again, anybody who's not familiar, not from the US, for example, but $65 billion on the table for broadband infrastructure development in the US. Sounds like a lot of money, but if you look at the map, you can go to broadbandmap.fcc.gov, and their categorization, from what I understand, is 25 megs, downstream and above, because, again, like we were saying before, the twisted pair DSL has a limitation to it. There's a lot of blank spots on the map if you take a look at it
Absolutely,
now. Yeah.
absolutely, and it's just not a lot of money in the grand scheme. Like, it's fair to say there is more private money than that
Hmm.
being invested today in fiber to the home. So, I
Right.
mean, it's a lot of money, but maybe what people don't realize is there's a lot of private money going into this today.
Hmm.
So, the business case works. If,
Right.
there's basic numbers here, but I mean, you can make the business case work to do it with private money. But again, if as this continue, like, imagine what it's going to be like when you start injecting that kind of capital into the system. Well, I think everybody's going to have a pickup truck and a backhoe at some point, right? Just so,
Yeah, just
you know,
start digging
maybe like
trenches,
the
right?
gold rush, right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, right. But the demands, for materials and so forth, we've kind of worked through a lot of that, after the COVID shutdowns with the chip issues and so forth.
Hmm.
So we kind of saw that initial bump in the curve to say, wow, what's, where is the expenses, how does this work into the model? So we kind of overcome, we got at least got a sneak peek of what's to come,
Right.
you know, where we might see, the, can the fiber optic cable manufacturers really keep up with
Mm.
demand?
Hmm.
Going to be a good question. I think they were chasing their tail for a little while there, right? And now it seems like things are getting a little bit closer to normal, but you know, we'll see when there's that much more money put on the table.
Right.
But I would say, from a private money, I just worry that there's it's investor money, so you always look at it a little bit differently. It's there's got to be some certainty to that, so that you can get those people to keep coming forward and making those investments.
Hmm. What about any legal issues? Yeah, and I've heard of lots of cases in the past of say sort of large provider fighting against an overbuilder. Have you run into that in this expansion as well?
We haven't seen a lot of direct, legal action. I would say that so there was a process run, I guess it was 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, called RDOF, and
Hmm.
it was like a reverse auction process where more or less you were bidding against other people, and it was more or less who was willing to put in the most money for that area would win the bid, if you will, for
Mm.
that region, and they would
Hmm.
get the offset, if you will. Um, one of the interesting things there was that because of the way the rules were written, it more or less locked down. If your community received an RDOF award, you weren't you well. And I don't know that this is completely true at this point because it went so poorly, but they were more or less locked down, or they were supposed to be prevented from getting other federal funds.
Right.
So if you went through this cycle, you didn't get to go after this other cycle, if you will. In that there were really no penalties to bidding it down.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
so you could. I'm not suggesting. I guess I'm not
Don't do
suggesting
this.
anybody.
Yeah, don't try this at home. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
But there was a possibility that people would go in and they would bid deals down to the point where they would win them, but probably have no intention of ever actually building them.
Hmm.
because there's no penalty and it would prevent competition
Right. I
from coming.
see. Yeah. Hmm.
So, it, it was kind of, again, and I think there's been obviously a lot of turmoil from that point on. And then when this additional infrastructure money was announced, a lot of people were like, well, hold on a second, maybe we don't want this other thing anymore.
Hmm.
Maybe we would rather do that one kind of thing. So we really haven't seen any like direct legal exposure there, but it's been more, I guess it would be more subtle, if you will.
Hmm.
They were
Hmm.
a little bit more creative, if you will, if there are where there's barriers being put up. They're probably a little bit slyer about how
Right.
they do it. Mm.
Right. So in the end, the sort of still biggest obstacle is the basic physical geography and economic geography problem that it costs a lot of money to lay wire, hang it on poles, and then you have to be passing enough houses who have the willingness and ability to pay, right? So, and I think
Right.
you brought up a great point before that digital divide's not just about rural locations. I think the rural case is easy for people to understand because, of course, it costs more
Yeah.
money to have a longer wire to get to fewer houses. But in the urban situation, it might be sort of cases where infrastructure is complicated, right? So digging a hole in an urban environment is a lot bigger of a deal than digging on the side of a road, But also that there may be cases where there's the ability to pay isn't as good as in some other neighborhoods. How do you see us sort of getting over that, especially from the perspective of someone doing fiber overbuilds? Do you have to lower prices for, say, residential services, and then you make that up in business, or again, no specific numbers here, but what's your
Yeah.
sort of take on the economics there?
Yeah. No, we're not going into markets with a pricing model that's kind of a balancing act between the two.
Hmm.
So, for instance, when we do a fiber to the prem uh, project today, we're really not factoring business services into it day one,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So we really do look at it as this is a residential fiber build. Like how do we make sure that we're building a quality network that meets the needs of,
So
of
then
that
business
community.
sales might be the sort of icing on top of that major infrastructure
Yeah,
development, I think.
but we can't factor. I don't think, but well, I should. We don't factor that in
Hmm.
to business model, and we
Gotcha.
don't. And it's not like in it. I guess I would say it's not like we're looking at it saying, "All right, let's build the most conservative business model we can," and
Right.
then this miracle happens, and we get this all this other stuff. It
Right.
really doesn't work. We won't really look at it that way. We really do see it as this is a residential first
Hmm.
network, and then if you pick up the pizza parlors and barbershops along
Right.
the way, that's great, but it's not really the primary focus of the.
Well, these days, bandwidth demand is practically probably higher at a lot of residences than it is the pizza parlor anyway, right? So,
Exactly
yeah.
right. Yeah, no, without a doubt, without a doubt. Yeah, so when we look at our pricing models, we did our first market we did was really a test market. How to,
Hmm.
you know, to go in. So there's a lot of talk about, for instance, what the service levels, service types should be. Do you need do you have to have a gig and a 500 and do you need a
Hmm.
750? No,
Hmm.
you can make the jump from five to a gig, say, right? Do you need a 250 or whatever? So we were kind of figuring out, what our broadband speeds would be, that we would go to market with in our test market. But we're also testing, pricing is what's palatable and at these
Right.
different speeds as well. You know, um, and when you're looking at competition, typically in those markets, we're typically the third player. There's usually
Hmm.
an incumbent telephone company, a cable company, and then we're the overbuilder that's
Right.
coming in as the third guy.
Right.
So the pricing is pretty well defined, on the products as you come
Hmm.
in. Um, but maybe more importantly for us, it was, do we have to have an over-the-top video product? Do we have to have
Exactly.
do we have
Yeah.
to have a voice product, right? And
Hmm.
one of the things that we have found is that the more rural we go, the more important that over-the-top voice service actually becomes, because
Hmm.
for a lot of folks, cell towers aren't always in their in your
Right. They
backyard,
still
right?
need to plug a
So,
phone into a jack in the wall, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah. So it becomes a safety issue, right? They still
hmm
want that, the ability to get that 911 call in, right?
hmm
That type of thing. So as we kind of worked our way through to figure out, hey, if you can do it, from you can tag on a over the top voice line, and we have an over the top video product as well. It's not always something that you lead with,
right.
but it's definitely something that there's consumers that are still going to want them,
hmm
and how do you continue to meet that demand, because you're competing with people that already have those services in their
Right.
house,
Right.
and the desire to cut the cord, quote unquote, uh, it's kind of there. I mean,
hmm
streaming video is awesome until you have to try to figure out why with this streaming app my remote doesn't work the same as with
Right.
that
Yeah.
one, right? Everybody still wants that, that singular, like over the set top box experience. It's,
hmm hmm
so you end up with Roku devices and Fire Sticks or whatever to try to bridge that. But
We often joked here before Thursday night football moved to Prime that there's going to be a lot of screaming that night. Right?
right, well,
Yeah.
what, I guess from my perspective, it's funny when we saw that on the network, doing direct connects with content providers,
hmm
on our network for our internet. That was obviously, that's critical now. I have
Right.
to have that, as a service provider. We have to have that direct connect with Amazon
Right.
and with Netflix and and now whoever, Hulu or whoever, because they're all of a sudden live sports is showing up on them, and that's
You got to get a
people are not
bunch of
going to
eyeballs on the same thing at the same
all at the same time.
server. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
It's a little bit crazy. So yeah, so we've worked really hard to, make sure that we're staying ahead of that curve, if you will, to to have you know significant throughput, as well as least latency to those
hmm
content providers.
Right, so that the whole package works. Again, I really liked your point earlier that you can have a gigi at home, and that's great. But then there's so many places along the way to your destination that could bottleneck. That it's important to have that whole ecosystem running well.
Yeah, I typically challenge people that when they're in their residence to just do a simple trace route test
hmm
to any of the big content providers and see what you get. It's actually
Right.
pretty shocking sometimes. I've seen I've seen some broadband networks that have north of 18 router hops
Wow.
in
Yeah.
in market,
hmm
not just to get out of the
Right.
market. That's crazy. That's a significant amount of latency that just doesn't need to be there.
Absolutely. All right, so Jim, I want to wrap us up maybe with just if you could wax a little philosophical here of how are we going to do with sort of bridging this divide over the next several years? Do you see, in these developments that you've been talking about in terms of, whether it's the government money that's out there, the private money seeing some profit possibility in this? Are we going to get there in this decade?
Right. Yeah. So maybe we painted too dark a picture
Yeah,
earlier.
that's right. Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Yeah. No, I do think that a lot of the issues that I brought up, whether it's the speed and the cost, you know, that that's getting more and more of a spotlight, right? Once eyeballs get on that stuff, people start to drive change, and I
hmm
do think that there will be some significant change. As I said earlier, I'm not here to complain about the utility. Look, what a nightmare of a project they have ahead of them.
right, right.
They're all of a sudden there's 100, you know, no more than 100, right? Crazy companies like mine suddenly pestering them to get on their polls. Like,
Right.
what a nightmare it is. How many people that they have just to support that kind of expansion that, quite honestly, they weren't prepared for. They're
hmm
dealing with the same labor market I'm dealing with, right? I mean,
Right.
so getting more people. I mean, it's going to be it's something that we have to overcome. I think that there'll be um, more of the state governments, especially, will
hmm
focus in on that, from a PUC
Right.
perspective, to say,
Right.
hey, we've got to find a better way, guys, because this is we can't lose out on this money. I mean,
Hmm.
that's going to be the real driver. So I think as that stuff happens, it's going to take a couple years probably, in true form. It will never be perfect. We
Hmm.
all know that, right? But I do think that we'll see, as the money drives change, it will. Um, I think that we'll end up with a better utility infrastructure on the back end of
Hmm.
this as well,
Right,
right? I
right,
mean, we're doing a lot of upgrades on the backs of these broadband projects.
right.
So I think that's also another great outcome there. But um, but I think the maybe the reality of it is, we're going to make a pretty good dent in broadband in the country, as far as bridging the divide. Um, but even with the money that's out there right now, there's always going to be some percentage
Hmm.
that we just can't get fiber to.
Right.
It's just not going to work without a lot of help. So, you know, like I said, I kind of think it's going to. I think, as a matter of fact, I believe the BEAD money is planned for over. It's a 10-year cycle,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
it's $65 billion, but it's over 10 years.
Over
So
10
it's
years,
something
right.
crazy like that. Yeah. So I don't know how that's really going to work. We really haven't seen that yet.
Hmm.
Um, so like I said, I think as we go along, it's going to take time. I think that that technologies like low orbit satellite is still going to be a thing.
Hmm.
It's going to be a really important thing in more rural areas, and by offloading these services,
Right.
in the more densely populated areas, you'll get better throughput there.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, there's some physical geographies where pulling wires is just never going to make economic sense, even with all the public money in the world, right? So,
interestingly, so we did receive some state money recently, and if you do the math, I think the Ohio House Bill 2 money, which again, uh, if you take the entire thing, I believe it comes out to funding $10,000 per passing
oh
is
wow,
what was funded there.
yeah,
So it's a lot of money.
yeah,
I mean, I don't know what you're paying for your broadband, but
yeah, yeah,
to get $10,000 back on that number it's going to take a while, right?
yeah,
So,
for sure.
right. So, I guess, the motivation is there, I think,
Hmm.
to overcome it, and find ways. Um, what I just mentioned, that's actually state government money, has
Hmm.
nothing to do with
Right,
the federal
right.
money. So, like, money's coming from every possible angle to solve for it. You know, um, so I think there's hope, but
Hmm.
but it's going to take a long time,
Yeah.
a really long.
And just exactly to your point from earlier, that the time isn't just in figuring all of this out, getting it to the right overbuilders, but it literally just takes time to get linemen up on the poles and to fix everything up, right? When
Exactly
you
right.
imagine pole by pole, and imagine how many poles it takes to get to 150 million households in the US, basically, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Well, we've all had the opportunity to drive down the road, and you see this, kind of, cockeyed pole hanging over the
Right.
street or whatever.
Hmm.
You know what? Strangely enough, they don't allow us just to go out and put another cable on that pole. We have to
Of
fix it.
course. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but like I said, I do believe that it's not to paint too bleak a picture.
Hmm.
I do believe that there's a lot of different people working at this, very diligently, and it's exciting to see, the level of interest, like I said, not just in government subsidy money, but also private money. I mean, the
Right.
investors are lining up here to do this. So there's something there, right?
Hmm.
There's something in those hills, right?
Well, I always like to joke with my colleagues and say, I think there might be something to this internet thing. So,
Right. Exactly.
yeah. And like we said, over the past several years, we've seen at the residential level just how crucial all of that was for the world. We would have been in a much worse position. I end up saying this all the time, but if COVID had happened even 5 years earlier, before streaming had become a big thing, then that neighborhood infrastructure wouldn't have been as robust as it was, and we would have been in a very different world. So
I completely agree. Yeah,
yeah.
the efforts of the last, like you said, 5 years alone, have really changed. Even in, like I mentioned, the DOCSIS stuff.
Hmm.
Even in the with the cable codes, their ability to increase speeds up into that 400 megs. It changed everything for from a video perspective.
Yeah.
I think we were still sub 100 meg connections, so which is why it's interesting to hear 20 like that we're using 25
Right.
25 meg download. I challenge anybody to use 25 meg download for
I
any length of time.
agreed. Absolutely. Yeah. When you look at what you're actually using during and that's what I sort of brought that point up before, that businesses that are paying sort of a lot of money for this, for MPLS and stuff, still have pretty small pipes when you compare it to what you're talking
Right.
about here.
And we got to
So
work, yeah.
yeah.
In our ILAC, that's probably where we see it the most. We're working really hard to find ways to get speeds greater than that, further and further out,
Right.
and we call it edging out. We're constantly building
Hmm.
fiber and then, kind of expanding a little bit further from a maintenance perspective to bring fiber a little further out, a little bit
Right.
further out. So we make some big investments up front, but then, to get to the, the true edges of the network, it takes time and because it's very, very expensive.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, this has been really interesting. I love how we could bring it back from the perspective of, very often we're talking about, the global, DWM business or submarine cables, or to bring it down to that perspective of every single one of those bits is getting to some eyeballs in a house somewhere, and how to get there, I think, is a really fascinating story. So thanks for Jim for joining us. Is there any way that folks listening could keep up with what you guys are doing at Horizon? Where should they go to find you?
Sure. Yeah, so we're on all the typical social media platforms:
Hmm.
LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and such. Um, on our website, which is horizonconnects.com, we also have we do some blogs there as well, and white
Oh, good.
papers. So if
Hmm.
you're interested, those are good places to kind of see where we're winning some business, as well as some of our white papers or solutions that we've been able to put out there in our markets.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the time. This has been super.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.